Voices from L5 is brought to you by the National Space Society. Check them out at www.nss.org.
The act of moving onward means we pass these signposts. One of them was first leaving Earth. The next one is hanging out on the moon. What's next? The planets. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together. This fragile little world. This fragile little world. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together. This fragile little world.
Hello and welcome to Voices from L5. Today with us we have Dr. Lisa Lockard, PhD in Future Studies from Hawaii. Today she's going to talk to us a little bit about human migration to space and space architecture. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Liam. Thanks for having me.
You're so welcome. You've been one of the guests that we've wanted to have on the show for a very long time now. Ever since I started doing this, I think one of the very early requests for an episode was a fan asked us to look into how space settlements might be actively designed by professionals, and a search for space urban planning led me to spacearchitect.com or spacearchitect.org, which ultimately led me to your work. And then I think I sent a handful of emails which may or may not have been you. And ultimately, it was only recently that we actually got in touch through the Space Sociological Studies people.
Yeah, that was actually the first time I had heard from you, so I'm sorry if I didn't receive any of your previous emails.
Oh, that's fine. There's presumably a bunch of other Lisa Lockhards out there who are wondering who this Voices from L5 fellow is. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your studies. It's sort of a unique area of space studies, I think, and I think people would like to hear a little bit about it from your point of view.
Yeah, well, it was not intentional. I trained as an architect. I'm trained as an architect. I have my master's degree from Yale University, which I got in 1994. And after working in the profession for a while, I relocated to Hawaii to go into academia. So I started teaching there, and found a lot of the types of projects we were doing rather boring. And so I met the director of the Future Studies Research Center at UH, Dr. James Dater, who introduced me to the possibilities of working in space. And I thought, okay, this is novel, this is interesting, I want to do something different. And so that's how it started. Unfortunately, at that time when this is about 10 years ago, when I started to embark on this field, a lot of people didn't take it very seriously, and it wasn't really supported at the institution where I was teaching. And so I decided on my own and embark on my PhD. And so that's how it started. Okay.
So let's roll back a little bit real quick. How would you describe the field that it is that you work in? What is space architecture?
Well, I'm sure there's many different interpretations of that, and depending on who you ask. Obviously, the engineers who are working in the space industry already are working on one aspect of space architecture, but that tends to be predominantly engineering focused. And I think that there's a recognition that there's other aspects of architecture that are probably lacking in that particular vein. And so there's several of us who've gone into this field of space architecture, was just really looking at not just the physical habitat, but also the other aspects of architecture that serve the humans that use it. So beyond just the physical aspects of shelter and protection from the environment, there's also the kind of phenomenological, psychological, sociological aspects of the habitat, which are equally as important. And so that, at least for me, tends to be more of my focus in my field.
Right. It sounds like it boils down a little bit to how society and humans will live, not just how we get up there or how we work there, but how, our society and civilizations can either continue or change by being introduced to this new place and this new environment, and how we can adapt to it.
Yeah, precisely. I think this is an area that has been grossly overlooked in the past, but I think there is a growing interest and concern and understanding of the importance of these kind of aspects of the architecture. And engineering issues aside, if we were going to set up colonies on Mars or on other planets with humans living there for years, if not entire lifetimes, those sociological, psychological, phenomenological aspects of living there are going to be crucial to not just to survival, but also to the adaptation and to our ability to prosper beyond the first generation.
Mm-hmm. So let's delve into this a little bit then. Right now, I think it would be fair to say that most of the design for our space habitats, the ISS and some of the potential habitats and stations that places like Bigelow are designing, definitely favor a more utilitarian view. You know, they're very clearly designed to be a place in which people work, and their function far outstrips their form. Clearly, this couldn't continue if you were having hundreds of people living in space or on a planet somewhere else. And indeed, a lot of the designs for space settlement often have this sort of form over function look to them, especially when you look at old paintings of Gerard O'Neill's designs, and even things like the Kalpana 1 by Al Globus sort of have these very beautiful vistas within them that show these picturesque and green landscapes within a space settlement. What do you think that... I want to hear a little bit about how these various different things can affect people, and what our transition from one to the other could look like. I mean, obviously, we're not going to go from ISS submarine-style design to O'Neill cylinders with beautiful vistas and rolling hills. You know, that's not step two. But what is the interim? How are we going to see some elements of aesthetic design start to come into space settlements?
Okay. Well, first, I think it would be important to clarify what is meant by aesthetics, at least in this particular context, because when you talk to people outside the social sciences, there's a kind of misunderstanding of what that means and therefore the importance of it. So, and I encounter this all the time in teaching architecture. It's not simply about making spaces pretty or about stylizing them. At least the way I understand aesthetics in this particular context is about creating the experience of beauty. And beauty is not just visual. It's just not superficial. It's really an integral part of our daily lives, whether it's architecture or looking at paintings or beautiful works of art, or listening to good music, or eating good food, or being in the company of someone you love. Those are all moments of beauty that we absolutely need to have on a regular basis. And it's those experiences of beauty are the things that are what give us meaning in our lives. It gives us a sense of purpose. And so this is how I understand aesthetics in a kind of broader sense. And I would argue that it doesn't matter if there's 3 people or 300 people living in space. It really hinges more on the duration of habitation. So, you know, if you have a crew going out for 3 months, 4 months to the International Space Station, they can live fairly comfortably without meeting all of their needs. But if you're talking in upwards of 6 months to a year, when we're talking about now long-term durations in space, it becomes more difficult, more challenging to forego some of those other what I call higher order needs. If you're familiar with Maslow's pyramid, he determined this kind of hierarchy of human needs. On the bottom would be things like, of course, food, air, shelter, sleep. And then as you go higher up the pyramid, you see things that start to relate to the realm of aesthetics. So a sense of belonging, a sense of community, a sense of fulfillment and purpose, the experience of beauty and these kind of things. And so in the short term, I think crew members can forego addressing of those higher order needs. But if we're looking at traveling to Mars, where crews might be there for 3 years or longer, it would be extremely dangerous, I think, to the success of the mission, to the lives of the crew, to ignore the importance of those kind of aesthetic considerations. So that said, you asked me how would that be visualized or what would be the next steps. I think a lot of times, again, people outside of this field assume that as an architect that we'll just come up with some new kind of iconic or a kind of spacecraft iconography for that future. And I'm always very reticent to do that because, as you can see from science fiction movies of the past, any attempts to try to speculate on what things will look like in the future always devolves into caricature.
Right.
And it's not really born of a real deeper understanding of what the present factors are. So I think that, whatever those needs, whatever the spacecraft will look like will evolve on its own once we begin to recognize the needs that need to be addressed in the design. So in terms of aesthetics, it's really not so much about how it looks like as it is about how do we allow for moments of the experience of beauty in the crew members who are going to be in these alien, remote environments far away from Earth. To have regular moments where they can experience some kind of beauty in their lives, and which will be especially crucial when they're living millions of miles away from Earth in these remote, extreme and hazardous environments. The aesthetics will have more to do with about providing opportunities for these moments rather than any kind of particular style of architecture per se.
Sure.
So to that end, I think we really would be looking at the types of technologies that could be employed within the habitat that would create environmental interfaces. So one of the problems is when humans go to a place like Mars is they can't experience the exterior environment without obviously a lot of technological intervention, right? Pressurized suits and so forth. And their opportunities to go out and explore the Martian landscape will be very limited, partly because of the degree of risk involved in EVAs. But actually, it's those very things that are very important to be able to experience the landscape, to be able to have that connection to the larger environment, like the way we experience beauty through the experience of nature here on Earth. And so obviously it's going to be very heavily reliant on mediating technologies. One way to do that would be to create technologies not that serve a purely functional purpose, as is the case now, right? Which is to be able to increase work performance or allow the crew members to be more productive, but also to simulate the experience of actually being outdoors on Mars, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting how we often don't think about these small things that future explorers will have to be sacrificing. Like the very simple ability to go out and take a stroll is something that we all take for granted, but just something that is almost impossible, or at least very, very, very reliant, as you say, upon technology on Mars. And that very interfacing with technology in and of itself changes the experience of just going for a stroll.
Exactly. So it won't be a stroll in the sense that we understand here on Earth, but nevertheless it will be the experience of, taking that walk in the outdoors. And you're right, those are the things that we tend to take for granted, but will be really, really important for giving a sense of meaning to their lives for crew members living in extraterrestrial environments.
So we're talking about needs, and are the things that we need on our day-to-day basis to still feel a connection to our environments and still feel in many ways human. On Earth, we have some of these examples, like people who take very long jaunts in submarines. They feel a great deal of psychological stress. And issues adjusting both to that environment and when they get back, the ability to have these wide open spaces and explorations. And similarly, people on Antarctic bases who have to live in fairly scientific focused areas with perhaps not a great focus toward this sort of moments of beauty as you describe it. And again, more focused toward the work that they have to do. They also have these adjustment periods. I guess these are good analogs to people living in space and living on planets. And is this some area that we can delve into to see lessons that can be learned? Is there any sort of application of this theory and idea that we can point to right now on Earth as perhaps something we can start using in space soon?
Well, looking at the analog studies, that some of which you've mentioned, as far as I'm aware, there hasn't been a lot of research in the area of the importance of aesthetics or the arts in those environments or in those experiences. But there are certainly elements that point to that as a problem and start to give hints at how aesthetic considerations can really change the quality of life for either the researchers in the Antarctic station, or we see that also in some of the habitat simulations now that they're running. So, for example, a colleague of mine was at the FMARS habitat simulation in Devon Island for several months, and they had a single plant in their habitat, and it became a focal point for all of the crew members there. And it just, even though that wasn't part of the study, it gave an indication of how important it was to have something living in it besides themselves in the habitat. The need to be able to take care of something, to have something green, to have something that was reminiscent of their life on Earth. So we do see that there are some, at least some indication of understanding of that, but as far as I know, there hasn't really been any serious studies undertaken that really examine this issue as thoroughly as it should. One of the things I'm proposing is to develop what I call multi-sensory virtual interfaces, which would be these game stations, but not in the sense that of what we think of here now, but it would be a space where they could go in and there would be different types of technology that would engage all the different senses. So, screens for viewing, there would be obviously the acoustic aspects. I'm looking at technologies that could generate certain kind of smells or aromas, and anything that could address perhaps the haptic senses as well. So that we can create simulated environments within the habitat that will allow the crew members to have an experience of being outside the habitat, so to speak. So to give you an example, say if you were in this habitat on Mars and you wanted to experience being at the ocean. Of course, that's, living in Hawaii, that's something that would be very important to me. There would be maybe a large screen where they could see the ocean crashing on the shore, right? So that would be addressing the visual sense. And then we'd have the oral sense. You would actually hear the waves crashing on the shore. And then there could be, for example, the smell of the salt water in the air, and even little, some water vapor that would be emitted. So it would actually almost make you feel like you're at the ocean. And of course, this is not with the intention to dupe people into thinking that they're actually at the ocean.
Right. But to provide some equivalent for them to at least, at the very, very least reminisce about these actual places they can go. Give them some small version of that.
Yeah, exactly. And, at first I was very skeptical when I started doing research in this area I was very concerned about the authenticity of these environments, and that they wouldn't, like the word you mentioned, reminiscent would be more would make the crew members more aware of what they didn't have than what they had. And so I was very surprised to discover that this is in fact not the case, that if you create virtual environments that address all of the different senses, that even though cognitively we're aware that that's not a real environment, that it's a virtual environment, in some ways you can say our senses trick us into feeling like we are there. So we get the experience of that environment without actually having to be there. And it's found to be actually very satisfying. So if you smell, see, taste, and can touch all of those aspects that we associate with a particular environment, in fact, it is if you are experiencing that environment without being there. And so this is I think, where we're going to need to go in terms of developing kind of virtual technologies or interfaces for this aesthetic experience.
Mm-hmm. This brings us back to that earlier point of technology and adaptation, about how humans, throughout all of our history as a species, we've used technology to adapt ourselves to different environments and also to adapt the environments to our presence. And in many ways, I suppose, our migration and movement into space is just one more step in that road. Perhaps a little bit more of a drastic step than we've usually seen before, but still an example of us using our technology to change the area around us and to change ourselves to be able to live in those areas. So in your recent book, Human Migration to Space, you discuss human social evolution and human evolution as a whole, and how moving into different environments like space and using technology to adapt to them and adapting ourselves to them is a sort of next step in human evolution. Not so much a genetic evolution as much as a social and civilization evolution. Would you like to talk a little bit about how that comes up in your book?
Okay, sure. So yeah, the role of technology and the kind of decisions we make in terms of the technologies we're going to deploy in space is going to be a very important subject. So before I talked earlier about virtual technologies, and these can serve two different purposes. One is to kind of create familiar environments of Earth, or to give us the experience of beauty in a way that's familiar to us, and that's important too. But if we only provided those kind of experiences, then it's actually going to facilitate kind of maladaptation to the Martian environment. So that needs to be supplemented with different kinds of experiences. So experiences of the Martian environment itself, of things that are not familiar, so that we can become more familiar with them and create those kind of cognitive connections to them. So the use of virtual technologies is kind of twofold. One is on one level is to create things for which we are reminiscent or feeling melancholy or nostalgic about, and the other is to kind of introduce us to things that are maybe not only unknown and strange, but perhaps threatening to us, and help to alleviate that sense of threat or that alienation that we might feel. So right now there's a focus on habitation in space. And again, I don't think that this term is fully understood. Right now, if you look at the kind of efforts that are being made to facilitate habitation in space, it's looking more at issues of comfort, and well-being, making sure that there's appropriate opportunities for leisure and recreation in space. But another aspect of habitation has to do with adaptation. That is a little bit more complicated. I think that goes beyond the parameters of what they're addressing right now. So how do we feel at home on a place like Mars? Or, how can we manage to prosper or thrive there in the long term? Those kind of questions are the things that are brought up when you talk about adaptation. And so in some ways it has very little to do with comfort or leisure or recreational activities. And so we need to create, through the technologies, not just experiences of the outdoors for the purposes of having those moments of beauty, but also for engagement, that we need to be engaged with the habitat, we need to, with the environment, that we need to encounter resistances and obstacles as part of that process of adaptation. And we need to be able to negotiate with our physical surroundings. And this has been part of the process of evolution of all life on Earth. And without that, you cannot properly evolve. So, now that said, it doesn't mean that humans can go out onto the Martian surface without those technological interventions to mediate between their bodies and the Martian environment. But that we also have to think about how we can create opportunities for engagement, whether that's physical or psychological. And it seems a bit counterintuitive to talk about resistances, but when you think about the habitat on Mars, it's going to be highly controlled by multiple, life safety systems, and there needs to be an element which is perhaps not fully controlled.
In many ways, the dangers and risks and resistances that a culture experiences generally are some of the elements that make up what makes that culture unique on Earth. Elements on Earth that you look at, like harsh deserts breed a different culture than your temperate rainforests do, and those things in and of themselves end up becoming defining features of the people that live there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, correct. And in general, it's just the encountering with, the confrontation with the environment, the encountering of those resistances that allows humans or all living creatures for that matter to develop a kind of robustness or resilience. And that's what we need to develop if we're going to prosper in space, not just for a few years or even over the course of one human being's lifetime, but even for generations. And so that aspect, this cultivation of resilience and robustness is something that I don't think is part of the dialogue yet in terms of designing for the habitats. And so this kind of leads into the question of human evolution. It's very unlikely that because of the radical differences of any extraterrestrial environment compared to Earth, the opportunities for humans to evolve biologically are not going to be the same. And it's the radical intervention of technology that is going to precipitate that evolution. So, to some extent here on Earth, that has been the case. I mean, we've, biologists argue as to whether or not humans have really substantively evolved, for the last several thousand years, but, technologically we've supplanted biological evolution with technological evolution. And we're going to see that, elevated to a new level once we go out into space. So one of the things that I mentioned before, the virtual environments, that's one aspect of a technological intervention, but there could be other ways that technologies could be used to help us adapt to space. So there could be the use of prosthetic devices or genetic engineering that would allow us to function better on Mars or other extraterrestrial venues, rather than relying on just the habitat to shelter or protect us from that. So if we had the capacity through either prosthetic devices or through genetic engineering to breathe in Martian air, which has, scant amount of oxygen in it, then that might be a more desirable way to establish human colonies on the planet than by creating habitats which constantly have to protect us or shield us from those conditions which would be dangerous to us if we were exposed to them. Mm-hmm. And so that's one possibility for the way that humans might evolve when we go to Mars. The types of technologies and the intent of the use of technologies are going to be critical, and we need to give this some thought. So, as you mentioned before, the technologies now that have been developed have been for the express purpose of creating greater utility in the habitats. And I think that's fairly straightforward. But when we start talking about aesthetic experience, or how you create these kind of cognitive connections to the environment, this gets a little bit more difficult to quantify, because one, how do you understand what those are and how do you create them? And then two, how do you design a technology to facilitate that? And so it's not quite so easy as, say, developing tools to do a particular experiment, working in a lab. That's far more, albeit still challenging, it's quantitative.
You still know exactly what it is that you need, whereas when we're talking about these other sort of social aspects and these design aspects, it can be difficult, especially when, as we talked about earlier, the work and research really just hasn't quite been done enough yet to even ask a lot of the questions that need to be asked, let alone get the answers to them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is, once the importance of this kind of research is recognized, that's the first step. Then, how to study this, how to determine what kind of technologies might be appropriate is also going to be very, very challenging. And so I recognize that there's two different ways that you can approach the use of technology, what I call technologies of expedience versus technologies of experience. And a great deal of our technology here on Earth has been developed with the purpose of making life more convenient, more expedient. And in some ways, bypassing or circumventing the very resistances that I think are going to be absolutely important or necessary to encounter. And again, this is so counterintuitive to most people. We think of technologies the use of technologies to increase or maximize efficiencies, and not necessarily about creating experiences. So a really simple example of this is, say, an elevator. An elevator is a technology of expedience. It gets us from point A to a vertical point B much faster than if we used a flight of stairs. And so that makes the effort of going from one point to another point, or the ascent, much more efficient. It doesn't require any engagement of the body. It doesn't require any labor. It doesn't give us a sense, though, of the ascent or of the vertical distance traveled. So the stairs would be an example of technology of experience, and the elevator would be an example of a technology of expedience. So we have to be careful when we are designing different technologies for life in space, that we, not to completely eliminate technologies of expedience, those are going to be necessary still, but that we also incorporate technologies of experience as well.
It's important to make sure that we're still able to acknowledge the environments that we're in and the experiences that we're a part of. It's almost like when you go to a long day at work under the fluorescent lights, and you come out and it's nighttime, and it just feels like all that time's just lost or gone and wasn't really truly experienced. Imagine living months of your life at a time like that aboard, a space station without any of these technologies of experience that you talk about.
Mm-hmm.
It would be I don't think anyone would enjoy that experience, no matter how effective or efficient the technologies of expedience were.
Yeah, so not to say that we can do away completely with technologies of expedience. They also are important, but that we need to realize that that's not sufficient. Like you mentioned, the example of being in the office and coming out, in some ways we've lost some of that here on Earth, but we have other opportunities to have experiences here, whereas the habitat on Mars is going to be their entire world for that crew who's living there. And so whatever is built into the habitat has to be able to provide for the whole array of experiences, as well as efficiencies, and, everywhere from the lower order needs to the higher order needs. So we need to make sure that the design of the habitat can do all of those things, and not just simply serve as a shelter to protect against the hazardous conditions of the environment.
So takeaway points then for the chat. We need to take a houseplant up to the ISS. We need something to care for, so I think we should go back to space roots and have some more space dogs up on whatever colony we end up going to. And we need to experience the environment when we get up there. So mandated EVAs, I think, would be a good idea.
I can't speak to that because I think that's the realm of the engineer, but at least the experience of EVAs, whether they were physical or not, would be critical.
Yeah. So that seems like a fantastic place to wrap things up a little bit. I've really enjoyed this chat. It's been just a lot of really thought-provoking stuff going on in here. Is there anything before we go you'd like to plug? I know we mentioned your book a couple times, Human Migration to Space. Is there any other work that you're involved in, or any other places you'd like to point people to?
No, at the moment, right now, I'm just trying to. I'm looking to get some funding to actually try out some of the technologies that I've developed in the habitat simulation, the Mars habitat simulation on the Big Island. And so right now, just trying to find people who are interested in doing that has been a bit of a challenge. But if there's funding that comes through, that would be probably the next phase of my research.
Great. Is there anywhere people can hear a little bit about that? Is it on any websites or anything anywhere?
Well, it's High Seas, so it's Hawaii Space Exploration Analog Studies. They have a web page, and they're the organization that is responsible for running the different simulations on the Big Island right now. They've done several studies, and they're continuing. I think they have some funding from NASA to do a few more. And so I'm hoping, especially these simulations are becoming longer term. So they started out with 1 or 2 months, and now they're going up to 6 months and maybe even a year. And that would be the ideal scenario to test out some of these technologies that we're talking about for long-term adaptation. So that's where I'm hoping to go in my next phase of research.
From L5. Couple things before we go. I want to say a big thank you to John Boswell, who makes Continue Science. That's the music that's playing right now, and the music that plays right at the beginning. Check him out at YouTube under Melody Sheep. Secondly, I want to say a huge thank you to all of our Patreons, but especially Nick LaCrome, our current $10 Patreon. Without you guys, the show wouldn't really be going anywhere. And the biggest news of all, of course, is that this microphone that you're currently hearing me from is courtesy of our Patreon donators. So thank you very much again. If you guys are interested in becoming Patreon donators, check out my Patreon. That's patreon.com/voicesml5. We got some really fantastic goals and some really great stuff we want to do with the show in the future that we need a little bit of support to get there. Check it out. As little as $1 a month really does make a difference. If you guys want to support the show in a different way, feel free to like, share, subscribe, link this show around a little bit, tell your friends, and vote 5 wherever you might be listening to us. It really helps to get the word out that way. Lastly, I do want to say if you guys have any interest or feedback or anything you just want to talk to me about, feel free to email me at voicesfroml5@gmail.com. I check it all the time, and I'm always on the lookout for new guests or show ideas. Thanks, guys.